I think we could have much of this material going on. Thank you, Glidden. Very interesting. Peter Wright is next on our schedule. He's got a video here about the museum. There's several museums now where we can go and see our history, and the one in Westchester, Pennsylvania certainly is the big one now. Peter, you want to say a few words, and then we'll run your video.
Well, good morning. Nice to be here. And I just wanted to tell you a few things. This is supposed to be a pioneers group. I suspect that a large number of you folks here are engineers or designers or manufacturers. I don't know whether I'm a pioneer or not, except I've been in the helicopter business for 56 years. But I have been entirely, with a small exception, short exception, in the commercial operating end of the helicopters. Most of the people I know are, at least in the American Helicopter Museum that I represent, most of our volunteers, we have about 250, are engineers or designers or manufacturers. And I like to tell them that I'm not an engineer, I'm not a manufacturer, I'm just start off as a helicopter salesman, I guess. Anyhow, I like to tell people that anybody can design a helicopter. That's real easy. Nothing to it. The real trick is to make money with it. And I don't mean sell it to the military, although that's a good way to make money. I mean take it out and take a machine and take it out and get people to pay you to use it in their business or for whatever they're doing. So anyhow, that's my business. I started off by joining the Navy back in 1939 and learned to be a pilot down in Pensacola. And I was on an aircraft carrier for a year or so. Then I resigned from the Navy in 1941, went out to China and flew for a year with the Chinese Air Force. Then I came back in 1942 and flew the Atlantic for 4 years, 2 years flying Sikorsky flying boats. So Sergei's here somewhere, and I think he remembers those and some of the exploits with his dad. But anyhow, in 1946, I was flying out of LaGuardia Airport at the time. That was before Kennedy was built. I came home to Philadelphia, where I lived, and my father said there's a new gadget that's been flying around here called a helicopter. Have you ever seen one? And I said, well, I don't think I've seen one, but I don't know much about them, and I don't think much about them. And he said, well, they're starting up a new company in Philadelphia, and they're going to fly out of Camden Airport, because Philadelphia didn't have an airport in those days. And so I jumped in my car and went over to see what it was all about. I arrived over in Camden, New Jersey, and found there was a company called Helicopter Air Transport. First commercial operating company in the world had started up. I went in to see the head guy that was running it, Norman Edgar, whom some of you may remember, and asked him what are they going to do with the helicopters? And he said he didn't know. And I said, gee, I never went to business school, but it sounded to me like he was starting it up sort of the wrong way. But in any case, after about 2 or 3 hours and a flight in a Bell 47 by Joe Mashman, he'd just flown in to deliver one of their Bell 47B models. He gave me a ride, and it's never happened to me before in my life, even when I got married, that I ever fell in love just immediately. I fell in love with a helicopter, and I've been in it for 56 years. But in any case, I had a wonderful experience flying. I didn't fly. I decided I wanted to get out of flying. I was a senior airline captain, and I didn't think there was much future in the airlines other than just flying, which was okay. But I wanted to get into something else, administration and sales and so forth. So they hired me as a salesman. And I had an opportunity to fly and get checked out, but I decided not to. I had a theory that you ought to stay current in your aircraft if you were flying it. And I didn't think I'd do that with a helicopter because I was so busy running around trying to get business. To make a long story short, we got a lot of interesting jobs. The most interesting thing, and I believe the most important one that I ultimately sold, was selling the first oil exploration job ever done by a helicopter in the history of the world, as far as I know. It was in 1946. I sold the contract to a geophysical company in Louisiana that was working for Standard Oil of California. The problem was they were doing a magnetometer survey, you got to put a little magnetometer, put it on the ground every quarter of a mile or so forth in a marshy area in Louisiana. And the work was being done by marsh buggies. They were great big machines with huge big tires, very slow. And the important thing is, or the important thing to the helicopter industry was, that these big tires would squash what were the name of those animals that they were hiring? Muskrats. They were raising muskrats. And the big tires had squashed the muskrat huts, little bumps in the earth. And so the muskrat farmers tried to stop the oil company from exploration. But even with that problem, it was a terribly slow job moving around with these great big marsh buggies. We came in with a Bell 47B model, which could only hold a pilot and one passenger, and the magnetometer, which fortunately only weighed about 50 pounds or less. And we showed them what we could do. And I was absolutely amazed. We trucked this helicopter down to Houma, Louisiana. We started flying it. We started the job. And all of a sudden, people came in from all over the world, from South America, from Asia, from all over the United States and Canada. They're all geophysical people wanting to see what this thing was about. We were on the job for about 3 or 4 months. It was supposed to take 1 month. We had to change engines. We changed the transmission 2 or 3 times. We had the usual problems that you have starting out. But when we worked, we did as much work in 1 day as a marsh buggy could do in 3 weeks. And it just revolutionized the business. Well, while I was down there, the company went bankrupt. I was stuck down there. I'm still waiting for my last paycheck. But in any case, I came back. I went up to see Larry Bell. We were the only helicopter operating company in the United States at the time. I went to see Larry Bell, who I got to know pretty well, up in Buffalo, about starting up a helicopter company to take over this work, because the oil companies wanted to continue it. He agreed to help us, but the insurance rates had gone up to about 30%, hull insurance. I couldn't get anybody to finance me. I didn't have any money. And so I just got out of the business, and I went to work for Frank Piasecki for a couple of years, working with Harry Pack and was trying to sell the HUP to the Navy, which turned out to be successful. In any case, that was a fascinating experience, and I fell in love with the helicopter business, and as soon as I could, I started my own company. In 1953, I started Keystone Helicopter Corporation with $50,000 and 1 used Bell helicopter. Today, Keystone Helicopter is the largest and the oldest, and I'm almost sure the most profitable commercial helicopter company east of the Mississippi. We have about 360 employees. We do roughly $175 million worth of work a year, and it's a good little company. My 2 sons run it. But in any case, when my sons took over the company, I decided that I'd get out of the business as far as running the company, and I got together with a bunch of guys in Philadelphia, and we talked about starting a helicopter museum. The discussion came up because of the 50th anniversary of the American Helicopter Society, the group we're sitting with today. And the people in Philadelphia wanted to make a big splash, so they said, let's start a museum. And I said, well, the 50th meeting was in about 4 months. And they said, well, that ought to be enough time. Well, I don't know if any of you people started museums, but 4 months, maybe 4 years is a short time. Anyhow, we got together and we started the American Helicopter Museum. We consider it the first and only true helicopter museum in the United States of America, or in North America, now that we're up here in Canada, in North America. We started in 1993 and formed the company. And in 1996, 5.5 years ago, we opened up for business in half of a rented hangar in Westchester, Pennsylvania. It's the site of the old MBB helicopter facility. As many of you know, MBB merged with Aerospace and moved down to Texas. So we rented half of one of their hangars, 35,000 square foot hangar. We started with 20 helicopters, 3 of which were on loan from the Air and Space Museum, the Smithsonian. Frank Piaseki's PV-2, the oldest Bell helicopter, Model 30, and the XR-4, the first production helicopter, I've been told, in the world. Along with that, I had collected a number of helicopters, so about 8 of those have gone into the museum. And then we have some that have been donated to us by individuals and on loan from the Air Force and the Army and the Navy and the Coast Guard. We presently have 36 helicopters on display. We have 4 paid employees. We have 250 volunteers, and they're the life of the museum. Without the volunteers, there wouldn't be a museum. They put in these volunteers over 135,000 man hours of free labor. We have had about 135,000 people go through the museum. One of our selling points, you might say, besides the fact that we're a unique facility, and we don't have any fixed wing, just rotary wing. What we do is we let the children, go through as many helicopters as possible. 8 of them are set up where the kids climb inside, work the controls, throw the switches, literally destroy them if you're not careful. But anyhow, the kids just love this, and their parents love it, and the teachers and so forth. We have a strong school set up. We're working with the local schools. This year so far, we've had 420 Head Start, little kids, little bitty kids, 3 and 4 and 5 years old, just love helicopters. As most of you know, there's a big shortage in the United States of helicopter pilots, mechanics, engineers. And if we don't get these kids in the early ages, in the young ages, interested in our business, aviation, and helicopters in particular, or rotary wing, we're making a big mistake. And we think we're doing our part, and we want to continue and grow. We've we've outgrown our facility of 18,000 square feet. We're now in the process of buying the building that we're in, which is 35,000 square feet, knocking the curtain wall down, and so we'll double our space. We have a $4 million capital campaign which just started up. We've had $500,000 put in by members of our trustees and friends. And a couple of months ago, or last month rather, in May, I flew out to California and picked up a check for $1 million from a helicopter manufacturer. And you'll be interested to know it was not Boeing, it was not Bell, it was not McDonnell Douglas, it wasn't Sikorsky, it wasn't all the nice European manufacturers, Eurocopter and so forth. It was Frank Robinson. If any of you guys know Frank Robinson, if you don't know him, when you see him, go over and shake his hand. He's a wonderful guy. He's my best friend right now, to tell you the truth, after the $1 million. But in any case, he's a great believer not only in the helicopter business, obviously, in the future of it, but in getting people into it, getting younger people into it. And he also gave $1 million to the Air and Space Museum a couple years ago. So we like to say, the American Helicopter Museum and the Air and Space Museum are on a par. We're equal. They're a little bit larger. I want to show you just a few minute show, but I want to mention three things that we're interested in. Number one, I'd like to mention that John Schneider, one of the great things that happened to us, besides the Air and Space Museum offering us these machines when we had nothing, just a paper museum, they had enough faith in what we were going to do, was the fact that I met John Schneider. I'd never met him before. He, of course, retired from Boeing, and he became our official historian. And he was a tremendous help to us. I mean, Ray or whoever it was started off, Dan Newman said that he knew everything and knew everything about helicopters and where to find out about any old antique helicopter. Well, he sure did. He was a tremendous help to us because we've had a lot of pieces and parts and old helicopters offered to us, and some of them we had no idea what they were. But John always knew, and he was just a wonderful guy. And not only that, he was a wonderful gentleman. Anyhow, the three things I'd like to mention is, number one, membership. We have over 1,000 members, but we need more members. Members are a big help to a museum, and also the museum can be a help to the members. We keep you posted on what we're doing and so forth. I'd like to ask every one of you and any of your associates to join the museum. I'll leave somewhere around here some booklets on membership. It's $50 a year, and you'll be doing something to, besides all the other things you do, to help the helicopter industry. The other is archives. We have 10 volunteers and 6 or 8 computers working on our archives. We have thousands of pictures and photographs, manuals, all kinds of things, models, original artwork, and so forth. We're very anxious to increase all that. We'd like you all to think, as you get a little bit older, I had a birthday last weekend. I'm 85 years old, and I'm starting to think about what might happen when I go to the big helicopter hangar in the sky. But I'm going to leave all my stuff to the American Helicopter Museum. That's pretty obvious. But one of the reasons I feel confident about it is Ray Prouty, 3 years ago, wrote me a letter and said he had quite a collection of helicopter materials and so forth. Obviously he does have, and he's leaving it all to the Helicopter Museum. So any of you folks, any of you ladies and gentlemen out there might keep that in mind. Not that I want to talk about what might happen, will happen to all of us sooner or later, but just keep us in mind, or anything, and if you retire that you going to toss out and your wife's going to toss out, or your husband, in a dumpster, why, call us and we'd love to come and either come and get it or send it to us, because we like to collect almost anything about the early days of rotary wing. The other is, and I don't like to end up on a sour note exactly, but we are in a fundraising mode. We've raised $1.5 million out of the 4 we're trying to raise. So if any of you folks would like to reach into your wallet and give us a little help, we'd certainly appreciate it. And so with that, I'm going to turn on the show and show you a little bit of what we're doing.
However, new designs were required to fill special needs. Soon, rotary wing aircraft were designed to not only land in tight areas, but hover and fly sideways and backwards. By the 1970s, helicopters were a vital part of everyday life, from transporting troops to repairing high-power wires or fighting fires. Today, skies are filled with helicopters, reporting on traffic or speeding accident victims to hospitals. Because helicopters can fly where nothing else can go, they see their most thrilling and dangerous
types of flying machine could have been built and flown successfully 2 to 3, possibly 4,000 years ago. We have seen in the museums the woodwork and the battle carriages and the weapons of the Greeks, the Romans, the Assyrians, and the Chinese. And in the words of Igor Sikorsky, there is no doubt that the technology was there, the sinews, the glue, the cloth, the varnishes, so that at least three kinds of flying machines could have been built and flown 5,000 years ago. And these are the hot air balloon, the large man-carrying glider, and a large man-carrying kite. However, mankind could invent and dream, but could not make it work, probably because of the fact that at that time, the current wisdom was that man would never fly. And if you are convinced that you cannot fly, then certainly you never will be able to fly. My father was particularly interested in the Egyptians, who had probably the closest idea of required wing area, and also, terribly important to fixed-wing people, aspect ratio. If you take a look at some of the aspect ratio of the wings that they created, whether this is art or whether this is science, you realize how close these people were, at least the artists, intuitively, how close they were to science. There is not a culture, there's not a people, no matter how advanced, no matter how primitive, that did not have their dreams of flight. It's also interesting that mankind first tried to imitate the birds, also the sketches of Leonardo da Vinci. It is also interesting to remember my father would quote the words of a great Russian scientist, Professor Zhukovsky, who said on several occasions when talking about mankind and his first attempts to fly with the ornithopters, or man-powered flapping wings, the very, very beautiful phrase that man will fly. Now, mind you, this is 1885 that he made this statement. Man will fly, not by the strength of his muscles, but by the power of his mind. And I think these words start the era of the Lilienthal's, the Adair's, and all of the maxims that contributed so much to flight. They also postcede the work of Leonardo da Vinci and a number of other great artists. The helicopters went through a number of variations, and eventually, along with hot air balloons, at the turn of the century, we can say that there's no doubt that the Wright brothers conquered heavier than air flight. And immediately, with the conquest of heavier than air flight, aviation became possible. It is, of course, interesting to note that Paris was, at that time, the center of aviation, but aviation was neither an industry nor a science at that time. It was probably closer to an art and a passion, and to many a miracle. Igor Sikorsky started with the helicopter, his first love. And in 1910, when he built his first machines, he later would characterize these aircraft as follows. The lack of success of my first two helicopters was due to two factors: lack of horsepower and lack of know-how. And basically, that's what it's done. He also gently explained at that time that even though the catalogs listed the early engines in 12 and 20 and 30 horsepower, my father secretly insisted that this was actually 20 or 30 dog power, possibly even cat power, because of the fact that the brochures, to put it mildly, were terribly optimistic as to actual horsepower delivered. The intensely romantic period of aviation is followed. It is interesting also to realize in those early days, think of it, that from the first flight of the Wright brothers to the first flight of the Grand, and shortly after that to this Ilya Muromets that you see here, was 10 short years from the first hop of the Wright brothers to this, the first four-engine, fully enclosed cabin airplane. A unique aircraft, and yes, there is a man sitting on the wingtip of the aircraft out there, Vladimir Panasyuk, the chief mechanic and an old friend of my father's. This aircraft, in my father's words, was very unique. It took off at 60 kilometers, it cruised at 60 kilometers, and it stalled at 60 kilometers. But other than that, it was a very successful and interesting machine. In those very, very beautiful early days of aviation, there was a number of phenomena. One of the phenomena, in my father's words, was the fact that the early engineers were almost always the early test pilots. This had the fortunate result of eliminating poor engineering very early in aviation. Other words that are just as true today as they were in those days, the words of a great French pioneer, Ferdinand Ferber, when he said to young Igor Sikorsky, 1910, "To design an airplane is nothing. To build that airplane is very little. But to test it and develop it into a successful machine, that is 95% of the challenge." That, ladies and gentlemen, is still as true today as it was then. It's interesting to notice also to the engineers and the test pilots in this room that the load factor of the Grand was, believe it or not, an incredibly fragile 1.5. But in Igor Sikorsky's words, he said it was probably more productive to fly and demonstrate the four-engine aircraft at a load factor of 1.5 than it would be to stay safely on the ground with a load factor of 2.5 or 3. And consequently, he did it. Then, with the end of the series of the Ilya Muromets, Igor Sikorsky came to the United States, started to dream of flying, built a number of successful aircraft, and already in 1928, 1930, the first sketches begin of a new helicopter. The 1920s were also, and the 1925 were also the days of the starvation in aviation. And again, there's the story, Roosevelt Field, Long Island, and a shabby gentleman named Igor Sikorsky, without too much money, but with a great love for aviation, is walking down the flight line. And the next hangar, there's a very tired old training airplane, probably a Curtiss Jenny, warming up, and a very nervous pilot about to make his second or third solo. Igor Sikorsky walked up to this young pilot and said, "Young man, when I started it to learn to fly, we did not know if the airplane or the pilot was capable of flight. In your case, 50% of the problem has been solved." Long ago, as he began to work on the helicopter, I think he remembered the words of an old philosopher who once said that the birds learned something very important many, many hundreds of thousands of years ago. Namely, they learned that it is far easier to stop and then land than it is to land and then try to stop. And airplanes can fly anywhere, but they cannot land anywhere. And consequently, he began to work on the helicopter. It was a hard job. The hardest job of all was to convince United Aircraft to attempt a helicopter, and then on top of that, to attempt a helicopter in a configuration that had never worked before, namely a single main lifting rotor with a small tail rotor. Attempts had been made, Yuriev in Russia before the revolution, and then of course the pioneering work of von Bonhauer in Holland and Tsagi in Russia, but the Tsagi attempts especially were at that time highly classified and secret. At any rate, he remembers the following conversation when an engineer asked him, "When will the helicopter fly as efficiently as the airplane?" And Igor Sikorsky answered, "I know the answer to that, never." "When will it be as fast as a fixed-wing aircraft?" Igor Sikorsky answered, "I know the answer to that as well, never." But, he continued, the helicopter will be able to do a great many other things that no airplane can do, and in fact no other machine yet invented by man can do except for the helicopter. And so consequently, he followed in the path of Dascagno, and he followed in the path of Breguet, and followed into the path of Heinrich Fokker, and except then he went into the single rotor machine. This, by the way, is the Tsagi single rotor aircraft, two anti-torque rotors, one at each end of the machine, and then eventually the Fokker machine, and now we come to this trainer, the first synthetic trainer as far as I know. We have never been able to find any drawings of the VS-300. We have exactly 4 sketches, and these 4 sketches are all that we have ever found on the helicopter. Everything else on it was verbal description. Let's do it this way, and let's make it very quickly adaptable to changes. The VS-300, as it is originally rolled out in 1939, and then the very first flight, of course, as you see here, and the wonderful chance, in Igor Sikorsky's words, to relive one's life all over again, to design and build a new type of machine without knowing how to build it, climb into the aircraft, start the engine, and start your first test flight without ever having flown a helicopter before in your life. It was, in my father's words, a chance to repeat life as it was in those days. The configuration of the helicopter went through about 200 minor changes, several changes. I'm not going to bore you because of the time here with the changes, but basically you can see it going through a variety of configurations as Igor Sikorsky teaches himself to fly, experiments with the 3-tail rotors, submits a bid to the United States Air Force for a new machine to be called the R4 with the same tail, triple tail configuration as the VS-300, eventually works out on the first public demonstrations. The first Army pilot, Colonel Frank Gregory, starts to fly this machine and says, you know, Mr. Sikorsky has something, and it is coming. Gregory, a highly experienced autogyro pilot, is the first person outside of Igor Sikorsky and Serge Glukharov who flew the machine. The tilt of the tail rotors is experimented with, and at that time it is considered that something is bothering those 2 rear rotors because vibration starts, and it probably is downwash. Nevertheless, world's records are established very rapidly through 41, 42, and then it goes into the sesquitandem. It's an interesting period of about 15 to 20 flying hours with the VS-300 as a sesquitandem rotor. And you can see here the tail rotor gearbox very, very close to the vertical pylon. On the day that my father was practicing for a demonstration to the board of directors of United Aircraft, he made a somewhat rough landing, boom, and knocked 3 inches off the tip of one of the tail rotor blades, the 2 blades. And of course, absolute panic, because how are we going to fix this in time to show the machine? One of my father's closest friends, an ex-naval officer named Boris Labensky, walked up with a hacksaw and cut exactly the same amount off the opposite tail rotor. They repainted both tail rotor tips, and believe it or not, 3 hours later, they flew a very successful demonstration for the board of directors. They did put the tail rotor further out, as you see on the next modification. Again, sesquitandem machine. Then the decision to go to an unlimited, completely cyclical control, main rotor and tail rotor. This is the first flight of the final configuration made December 8, 1941, 1 day after Pearl Harbor. The helicopter proved to be an instant success and began to show greater stability, controllability in flight. And in 1941, 3 weeks after that, was the first flight of the R4. I think to the engineers and to the pilots in this room, I think the greatest proof of the fact that Sikorsky was slowly beginning to become expert in the helicopter was the fact that on its first day of flight, the R4 made 6 separate flights and logged a total of 36 minutes in the air, rather unusual for a first day, first flight machine. The helicopters have gone on to become very, very useful instruments for the saving of human lives. The VS-300 itself, after 3 years, roughly 120 flying hours, was retired to the Ford Museum. It was interesting there at the Ford Museum that Igor Sikorsky was, after demonstrating the helicopter, a little lady stopped him and said, "Mr. Sikorsky, this is a wonderful machine. It does everything possible. It's a magic little aircraft." And Mr. Sikorsky smiled and said, "Thank you. I think it is a very pleasant aircraft to fly." There was a moment pause. "But tell me, Mr. Sikorsky, what happens if the engine stops?" There's a pause, and Mr. Sikorsky very politely explained to this little lady the aerodynamics of auto-rotation and the fact that the helicopter can be landed safely. The little lady stands there for a second and says, "Well, what happens if one of the rotor blades falls off?" And Mr. Sikorsky stood for a moment, politely bowed, and said, "Madam, we do not recommend it." I think I will close the briefing on the life and the work of Igor Sikorsky by saying, once again, he was very proud of the life-saving uses of the helicopter, very proud also of its use in a growing importance among the military, very proud of the fact that it had grown to create new forms of industry. Because I think if we stand for a moment and think of offshore oil, we realize that offshore oil and the drill rigs and the people working on them today probably would be uninsurable if it were not for the helicopter and its capability to go out and save lives. I'd like to close this very, very brief summary of the VS-300 and the helicopter by quoting 2 of Igor Sikorsky's words, and I think that they are still as true today as they were when he first uttered them. And one of them being, "Truth in politics is optional. Truth in engineering is mandatory." And the second phrase, that the history of the world has proven time and time again that nothing can replace the free work of free men, because that is where all progress starts. And the third phrase that I would like to leave you with here today, ladies and gentlemen, is a toast that Igor Sikorsky made some years ago. And again, I think those words are still as valid today as they were some 30 years ago, when in Washington he said, "Let us hope that in the future the statesmen and the politicians of the world will do their job as well as the engineers and the pilots have been doing theirs." Thank you, Ray, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Sergei. That was very good. Our next presenter is Don Segner, a test pilot from long ago, going to use the new technology here. I think it's all set up, Don, but we can get somebody up here who knows how to run it.
Do I go over there, or do I work from here? You'll do it, okay. Okay, you gentlemen, it's a pleasure really to be here and talk to such an elite group. I know many of you, Strachvici, Dr. Tishinkov. I met Dr. Mill in the 60s, 65 at Paris Air Show, and we were flying the XH 51A compound, which we took 300 miles an hour. But I'm not going to talk about that today. Ray made me promise not to do that. I'm going to cover a period, if you'd hit the next one. I am going to talk about a period of creativity. That's the period when I got placed in the helicopters as a fighter pilot. I did most of my flying in Korea. During World War II, I got in the end, I flew Corsairs. I was an early jet pilot, did a tour with the Air Force. Then I was placed in helicopters to try to bring some change in, as a few of us did. And after 10 months, 600 hours, I was sent to test pilot school. And when I got there, I was the only qualified MOS, military occupational spec, helicopter pilot in the school, but we got to fly everything. It was heaven for a pilot. We had supersonic jets, we had seaplanes, we had helicopters. But my job was to get through and get into the rotary wing flight test at Patuxent River. So it provided me with the opportunity to participate in a period of the 50s where it was a period of creativity and innovation by you designers. We needed, and we got increased capabilities of performance and handling qualities. We had numerous innovative rotor and control system design concepts. We had unique power and propulsion approaches to these power problems. We had unusual approaches to non-rotor vertical flight. We had very minimal design guidelines, little formal flight testing criteria, but we had lots of visionary people. Well, what were some of the needs that drove these visionary people? Well, for the Navy, which we were interested in because I was at Patuxent River, as a Marine, we wanted to increase the anti-submarine warfare capability for the Navy. So we were looking at the all-weather capability of both day and night, flying into and out of a hover in all-weather conditions over the water. Quite a task for a helicopter, and I used to say that a helicopter pilot is nothing but a rate damper, because helicopters were so unstable, and until the SAS came along, or the Lockheed Rigid Rotor, they remained unstable. All-weather flight capability both day and night, flying into and out of a hover, that's a task. We did that manually for many, many, many months. Or we even looked at alternatives, using water and landing capabilities to see if that would help us with our ASW capabilities by dunking sonar that way and what it would do. What are some of the needs? Continued. Well, the U.S. Marine Corps needed increased amphibious assault and maneuvering capability. The helicopter was the best way they felt that we could do that. They needed heavy lift, external and internal capabilities. I remember my first time meeting Sergei Sikorsky, or Igor Sikorsky, when he talked about carrying big tanks and cargoes over deep valleys and ravines. But he did it with an accent that I can't even duplicate it. And I thought, this guy, man, is a visionary. We needed to keep the troop together. We needed troop integrity. We needed movement by day and by night. We needed observation control and command and control. And we needed the attack close air support, the VTOL version for our troops. While there at Patuxent, I had the privilege of working with many, many aircraft manufacturers and numerous aircraft machines. I'll cover a few of them today. We had the Alouette come through, we had the Bells, we had the Brantley, we had the Cessna, we had the Doman, we had the Gyrodyne, the Hiller, Command, McDonnell, Piasecki Vertol, and the Sikorsky. Now, those are the main ones. I won't cover them all. Okay. The rotor types tested, oh, I'm sorry, you can click on. Okay, the rotor types tested. We looked at the single rotor, the fully articulate and clockwise rotation rotors. We looked at single rotor non-articulate with counterclockwise rotation. We looked at the syncopter. We evaluated the tandems and tested them, the coaxials and the teetering. So just about every concept that you all came up with, we had the opportunity to test and evaluate either for concept evaluation or for operational use. Let's go to the next one, please. The propulsion systems. We had the reciprocating. We had the very first, well, we had 2-cycle engines, 4-cycle aircraft tank and automotive conversion engines at that time. You all know them, you had to work with them. What is your biggest problem? How are we going to get the power? The first large twin-engine aircraft Sikorsky in production, which was twin-engine, the HR-2S. The rotor system power augmentations, we used saw compressed air cold-tip jets, compressed air pressure jets, and tip jets of various configurations. And finally, the free power turbine engine, both single and dual. Okay. This, I think, is a unique slide. I had this taken when I was the only pilot there. My boss, who was a Navy commander, was killed in an accident when the blade came off the aircraft. And the other 2 pilots we had were Navy, decided they wanted to leave, so they did. But at that time, look what we had there. A little bit of history, so I had a picture taken. Here is the HR-2S, which was the largest twin-engine helicopter built in production that time period. We had the HUP, which is the tandem, the early tandem. We had that in 2 configurations. We had the first Syncropter, the HOK, the HUK for the Navy and the Marine Corps. We had the YH-31 hingeless rotor, the Doman. And you notice, gentlemen, it rotated in a different direction than the normal Sikorsky. It followed more of the mill design concept. And then we had the XRON coaxial. And I put this one in because this coaxial is different. It did not use the differential torque that we get, and therefore the negative problem you get with left rudder and right rudder when you're in auto rotation, and the mechanical reversers you had to have. I'll go on that a little bit later. It had tip brakes. Its max gross weight at that time was 600 pounds. The HTL-7 and the Hiller H-23D, we did the Army testing wherever there was a Navy project officer in the plant. The Air Force did some of it, but we did a lot of it. But the H-23D and the HTL-7 were both similar. Of course, one using the Hiller pattern, and the other one using the Bell teetering rotor system with its stabilizing bar. The Hiller, we found, was a little bit better performing. It was a nice airplane for what it was designed for, did a good job, had better performance in hot and humid weather, but Bell was a prettier and flew well, and the Navy liked it better, so it got the contract to go to the Navy to be the training aircraft. There wasn't that much difference in the 2 aircraft. The next one. This one was very unique in that we had a HUP that was rebuilt by Ito with floats, had a watertight hull, was beefed up, used fiberglass, changed the doors and other things and the structures of it. Turned out to be a very, very fine waterborne type helicopter. Of course, you save power when you're on the water, you save power when you're in ground effect. It could taxi well. It would work well in waves, except when they got too high, you could hit the tips of the blades in the water, so that limits there. We were demonstrating it once. A Coast Guard officer got in it and immediately rolled it over. So that sort of shortened the program. But it was a very successful thing, showing that amphibian stuff was possible. Next one, please. The next one was the S-62, which was nothing but the S-55, or as we call it in the Marine Corps, the HRS, with the T-58. This was demonstrated by Sikorsky. It was a very fine bird. It had a couple little problems. They were very minor. If you did an auto rotation at AFCG, it would always have a spray up and would shear the tail rotor. So that didn't work out too well for us. Then they took it back, and it did finally get certified, but it was a nice airplane. But they decided at that time that the amphibious portions were not there. We had to go into the IFR flying. So we did that. The H-23, the next one, I guess, is, the Dijon cold jet, tip jet. We liked the concept. We found it very unique. It had some advantages to it, but we sought limited capability for operational missions. So that was the end of our evaluation of the Dijon. Okay. The Doman H-31. This project purpose was to evaluate the unique Doman rotor system. As you know, as you just saw, it was unique. The project was hindered, however, by numerous aircraft deficiencies. It had malfunctions and failures. It was not sufficiently reliable to complete the evaluation that we wanted to do. It was hindered by transient fuselage oscillations in flight and also on the ground. Various malfunctions of the direction control servo and insufficient anti-torque rudder in a hover to stop a rotation. It had a limit on one side. You start turning the other, you couldn't stop it until you got in forward flight. Engines unreliability. We had 2 engine failures, and we had high instrument vibration, and I had to keep holding the door shut because it would vibrate open in flight. So that wasn't considered too good, but that had nothing to do with the rotor system. So we're trying to evaluate the rotor system. We had other things that occurred, and finally, after several tail rotor limitations and the tail rotor shaft failed in flight, we decided to terminate the project and say, evaluate the rotor in the wind tunnel, which we did. Next one, please. This is a McDonnell 120, which was out of the old little Henry and out of their other little converter plane. It had excellent flying qualities and performance. I really like this little thing. There's no vibration to speak of. The cockpit layout and visibility for the pilot, as you can see, was obvious. It was excellent. It was flexible, the flexibility of the fuselage. And the fuselage, they would put different stores in there. They could put cargo in there. It was really designed for firefighting, and it did a good job. The jets created, however, a halo effect. Next slide. And therefore, at night and in the daytime, or twilight, it was noisy, and you get a halo effect of the flame going around your head. So that wasn't too good. 120 dB was the noise outside of the airplane. But other than that, it was an excellent performer. You could carry, its VNE was 105. You could carry 1,000 pounds on a cargo hitch to 100 knots with absolutely no impact on the aircraft. It was very, very good, 1,210 pounds. Really liked it, but because of the noise and the halo effect, it just wasn't operationally feasible. Okay. Next slide, please. This is the HUK. It had a single engine, was 5 places, you know. It was Charlie Command Syncropter. And like a coaxial, when you're going into auto rotation, you had a mechanical mixer that would change you from right rudder, it would put in left rudder, obviously for the reasons power on and power off. One thing that we found about that is it was unique at high altitude because there was a dwell zone that I called, from down collective to come up a little bit when you're down at sea level. There'd be a point like you do with a coaxial where there's no control at all. But that was in a limited spot. And then you pull the power on, as many of you know, you could get your plenty of directional control. However, when you get to altitude, that dwell zone starts taking up the entire collective position for power. And my first experience on this was at 14,000 feet. And I leveled off because I could get it to 14 that day, lowered the collective a little bit, the nose swung to the left, the bank to the right. I had 70 degrees of yaw, 20 degrees of bank, and I got into a right spiral. And I could not control the aircraft. Tried to control it in pitch, had some control, but very, very little. Finally, after so many turns and getting down to 6,000 feet, we got enough Q over the tail to get a little C and beta back, got it out of it, and it worked. And I found out from talking to Al Newton up at Command, who was the chief pilot at that time, what is going on? He said, well, Don, you're supposed to roll into the turn. Now, here you are going down sideways in a spiral like a spin, and you're supposed to roll into it in a chopper. You roll into it, and over 40 degrees, it would kick out. Because you'd go up to 120 degrees of yaw, the tail would be there, and it would kick you around. I didn't think that was too good for operational use, so the seating was limited a little bit, but it was more than satisfactory for the operation that it was designed to do. And that was cargo work down low with the fleet and playing guard. So we went ahead and approved it with some restrictions and limitations. It was also very weak in performance, but the engine outperformed what it was supposed to do, but it had enough to do its job, so that was approved. The next one, please. Now here you see two together. That's me on the left side, and Jim Ryan was a fabulous test pilot for Frank Piasecki before he bailed out at 600 feet. in a structural demo, first one to do that. And he's with a gyrodyne coaxial. I'll talk about that a little bit more. The XROE, you may remember from the commercials in the old days when Dick Peck was flying it for Camels. They would fold it up and unfold it. Dick would get in, start it up, and take off and fly around. It was very limited in weight, 562 pounds, I think it was, max. We couldn't put radios in them because we put instrumentation on it. The problem with both of these aircraft is you couldn't let go of the stick or the collective in flight or at any time. So you couldn't do other things to adjust yourself. The XROE, because of the short coupling of the tail boom, had an extremely difficult tail rotor design problem. Structurally, it was very limited, 10 hours of life. The control itself, once you put in an input, say you put in 1/10 of an inch to the left, within the first 4/10 of a second, you would yaw 90 degrees. And then it would accelerate to the rate where you couldn't keep it up, and then you had a hard time stopping it. It would also then fluctuate. The torque and the rotor RPM would decay terribly if you were to the right or to the left. We finally discontinued it because I was checking out other pilots trying to see how they were going and what they could do with the aircraft. And the engine quit twice in the hover, and before they hit the ground from hovering in ground effect, they went around 360 and 380 degrees. So we felt this wouldn't be good for the trials they wanted to do in the Marine Corps, so the program was terminated. It was an interesting little one. On the next one, please. Now, what is good about this little bird is it had a Porsche engine. Well, let me tell you what is bad about it at first. You had to pull start a Porsche engine. No electricity on it at all, no battery. We had an instrumentation package on the bottom, but on the tips of the blades, we had flat plates. And instead of using the Delta like they did with the Syncropter and like they do with the Kamenov coaxials, it has a tip rake that would extend either on the lower rotor or the upper rotor, and that gave you your directional control. And it was outstanding. It was a nice bird to fly, except the engine kept wanting to quit, and you couldn't let go of anything because the stick would fall over. The biggest problem that we had was I was flying it in February. The biggest problem I had in one of my flights. And we kept worrying about, was I going to be able to see, would my glasses fog up and all those other things, and the downdraft would really protect you and do a good job of it. But when you go over into an auto rotation, the first time I did it, the downdraft came up, and my glasses, of course, fogged up, and I couldn't see a thing. So here I am coming into the ramp. I can't see where I'm going. I can't let go of the stick. I can't let go of the collective. What do? You wiggle your nose. So you look out of a little spot like a quarter on your glasses, and that was my first auto rotation landing. But it was quite a bird. It did everything it was supposed to do. It went on to Marine Corps demonstrations, and they evaluated it. One thing they wanted to do was train it for the infantry, and the colonel came down to me once. He said, "Can I train the infantry in this?" I said, "Yes, if you send them to flight school." He says, "Well, then they're not infantry." I said, "That's right." He said, "Well, can you train anybody to fly this?" I said, "If you're patient enough, you can train a monkey to fly, but it's going to take a long time, because this was more difficult to fly." The other thing that was disoriented was when you got up to altitude, about 3,000 or 4,000 feet. You don't have any reference in front of you, and your head was right on the roll axis. So you had no reference on these things. And believe me, that's where handling qualities come in and really disorient you if you're not very careful. One time I had an engine failure. I was about 3,000 feet. I had a chase plane, the HUK, and I'm over the Patuxent River, down in Patuxent River, Maryland. I had three choices. One was the river, and I wasn't about to do that. The other one was a field where they were plowing it 90 degrees to my course. The other one was straight ahead over some trees into a back farmyard. I said, discretion is the better part of the day. I'm going straight ahead because I know I can't land on those furrows with those little wheels. I came up on the trees. I had to flare it real hard. I hit the bottom of the aircraft on the top of these trees about 80 feet high, pushed over, came out and flared out and landed in the backyard. And here was this lady with her young boy, and I'm in an orange suit with a white helmet on. She threw her laundry up in the air, ran in the house, closed the door, pulled down all the shades, and she thought somebody from Mars came, I guess. But it was quite a sight to see. And the press played a lot with that one. But it was a good bird, and it did its job. It ended up being the Lamps aircraft for the U.S. Navy. They made it a little larger, put torpedoes on it, put a turbine engine on it, flew it remote controlled off of the back of destroyers. Okay. Now this is the bird that I consider to be the best reciprocating power helicopter ever built in that time frame. The HUS, as we call it in the Marine Corps, the HSS-1, and here we developed the HSS-1N working with Sikorsky. It was just a fantastic bird to do what you need to do. We used to go out and manually fly this on instruments under a blue amber and hover it, then go into the hover and out of the hover. Now this is before we had the auto throttle, before we had heading hold, and before we had ASE. We developed those one at a time. First we got the heading hold. Next we got the auto throttle. Then we got the Doppler in so we could hover over given area space. We developed that on the one end along with Sikorsky. They did the engineering, we did the flying portions and fed back to them. That really made these things into a great ASW aircraft and started developing, as far as I'm concerned, the leading to the HSS-2. It just did everything we wanted it to do. The only thing that we had a problem with was once when I was making a real high power climb, again trying to go up to service ceiling, and my collective came up and I went to roll the throttle off and the throttle would not move. It was jammed full open. And of course, when you lower a collective, what happens? It's going to overspeed. So what you do is you slow it down as high as you can, and then you just pull it way up, zoom up on the climb, get it down to 80 knots, at which time I then had the mechanic cut the mixture off. We always flew singly with a mechanic if we could, and cut the mixture and then did an auto rotation from 9,000 feet down the field. And put this out to the, what was I worried about? I was worried about going 130 knots and then having to cut the throttle there and with a high collective and getting into blade stall. So we put a bulletin out to the fleet that this could happen, and it did. And of course, the squadron commander, it happened to him, but he went to 130 knots, which is over the red line, and he pulled the mixture back and he went into blade stall. But this turned out to be a great airplane for us and for the U.S. Navy and for the Marine Corps, and of course the S-58. The next one. This one was quite a bird. I thought, in all respect to slats back there, I thought the H-21C was one of the worst flying birds that I've ever been in, except maybe the Hup. I mean, you want to go to the left, you'd push it to the right, and all those other things. You finally figure it all out. And this is the H-21D. They changed the transmission, well, they changed the rotor blades, the mass distribution on them. They changed several things in the aircraft. They put the turbine engines. They limited the two T-58s, and this was the first twin turbine evaluation we had. We had one in an HSS-1, but it was a single engine. It made all the difference in the world in that airplane. They put a SAS system in it. For some reason, the vibration went away. And with the SAS system, it flew like a jewel. But we had to stop at 140 knots VNE because of the windshield flex. So that was the only reason. It could have probably gone another 10 or 15 knots if it weren't for that. But with the new rotor blades, the T-58s, it was great. What did we learn from that? Quite a few things. One is that SAS will really help. We found a little bit of that in the HSS-1N. Two, we learned about transient droop and permanent droop of the T-58 engine. And we plotted those, and GE was able to work with that, funded by the Navy, I'm sure, or somebody, and came up with a new revised 3D cam at those days because it was mechanical, and got rid of most of that droop characteristics. So that's what got us on to the way we have all of our droop characteristics compensated for now in our new electronic controls. So it turned out to be a great little bird. Okay, the next one, please. That led to us flying this. This is one that was given to, a contract that was given to VTOL, I am told, as an intermediate way to keep them moving while they were doing the Chinook. It is the YHC-1A. We evaluated it just for a couple of flights. We brought more pilots up to fly it, including some of our very senior ones. And it turned out probably to be the most outstanding helicopter of that period that we had ever flown. In fact, in our report, we said it was, well, once before anything else, I'll say that it had an excellent cockpit. They listened to their test pilots, Leonard Levasseur and the others. That aircraft was designed for a pilot to get in and fly alone if he needed to do it. I can't say that for some of our other manufacturers. It had really close input. The final naval report said this aircraft was, quote, found to be capable of most of the missions, needs, and requirements of the Navy and the Marine Corps in the future. Major problems such as high vibration at high speeds were asserted. No, I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead of my. This was considered to be the outstanding advancement in helicopter design of that period. It went on to be the H-46, but the Marine Corps changed everything so much on it, it wasn't the same bird. So they had to work out those problems. Okay. This is another very unique aircraft, the HSS-2, with the first two 58s. It fully articulated, as you know, automatic blade folding came in for the first time. It was scheduled at first to go to 165 knots, but the vibration became pretty heavy out there. In fact, so heavy that the instruments would jump up and down, and my co-pilot would get ill once in a while. So we finally limited it back to 140 knots. And Sikorsky began working on the vibration problems. There was also some high vibration in the tail and some tail kick. But all those things were finally worked out. And with the automatic stabilization equipment, the capability of hovering in and out of a hover on IFR took some time, but we got there. And as you know, it's still flying today as Marine Corps One and flies the President around. The thing was not amphibious. As you can ask Stan Kakel, who was the GE test pilot. He lost one engine down on the Key West, put it in the water, tried to taxi in, he called for help. And the tower and the crew down there at Key West said, well, you're amphibious, just come on up the sea ramp. Of course, by that time, he ran out of power and the aircraft rolled over and sank, because it is not amphibious, as we all know. Okay, next one. The VTOL 76. Now here we get into the flights that we conducted. I was first one asked from the Marine Corps and the Naval Aviation to go down there. I wanted to show the pilots because they're very unique. On the right is my engineer, Webb Taylor, who was with NATC. The next pilot is a now passed away, Jim Reichert, who was a designer and the test pilot on Dokes, which is a VZ-4 on the right. Then you see Jack Reeder, who is the great NASA pilot. We did a lot of work together, an awful lot of work in simulators, Mercury, VTOL, and everything else, and Jack was down at Langley. Another one's a good friend of mine, Fred Drinkwater, who and I went to the Marine Corps together, and he was a test pilot out of Ames that did so much for VTOL. And Jim Whitten, who was a number 2 pilot to Jack Reeder, and I believe the fellow on the end was an engineer from VTOL. It was quite a unique aircraft. We could do a lot with it. I had a 20-flight program on it after they left. Why we're all together is that Jack Reeder and Leonard Levasseur had been the only 2 flying it before then. So the 3 of us all checked out in one day, and then I stayed down there for 2 weeks and went on with another test program. We learned an awful lot of things from that aircraft. It only weighed 3,400 pounds. It only had about 35 minutes of endurance. The wing area was only 110 feet. The envelope tested went from -5 to 110 knots in forward flight. We had an ejection seat that Jack had put in it, which was very nice, but you can only use it 300 feet above and about 80 knots and above. But that was better than nothing. Some of the things we learned on that, and NASA started making improvements on it, really turned out. It was finally flown by 28 different pilots. Now, one thing that people don't realize about this aircraft is that it had an automatic transmission from a Dodge car that coupled the drive systems. No mechanical coupling. It was all done by the transmission, the fluid transmission. But anyway, these pilots, I felt, contributed an awful lot. The Doke, of course, went on to do things. The problem with the Doke was it was very noisy. My concerns were at that time, this evaluation was to let the Marine Corps know, what are we going to do in the future? My concerns were, how are you going to bring it aboard ship with that big wing up? How are you going to fold it to get it down below deck? When you get the the wings down, how are you going to fire any stores off of it forward? Or with guns to rotate? They'll all have to be fuselage in line. All of those kinds of questions came up, and the Marine Corps considered it. That's one of the reasons I think they went more towards a P-1127 and the Harrier. And incidentally, the United States contributed $38 million to the early development of the P-1127 in that period of time. And it turned out to be a good airplane, took a lot of work, and some of my good friends flew it. Okay? So that's to give you a little bit of what went on. I'm not supposed to talk about anything past 1961 and my time there, and that was just a little bit of what we did. But I thought you'd take a look at this one here, because that's a picture of me and the bird. It's sunrise down in Arizona. I'm at 22,500 pounds, 8,000 feet, and I'm cruising at 200 knots. That wasn't too bad. It's the only airplane that I know of that has velocity damping. It's the only airplane I know that can go compound with all the stuff not coming down in front of the wings so you can fire stores or out to the sides to the right. It's the only airplane I know of that was totally IFR capable without any SAS. No electronics to help you with your pilot controls. It's the only airplane I know of where you could take your hands off of any speed. You'd come in, if you wanted to hover, set your trim tabs, let it go, it would go into a hover and sit there. It met all the little specs, and it answered all of the issues except one. How do you beat the politics? Thank you, gentlemen. I hope that helps.
Not yet, just a minute. Several of us here have got fond memories of the Cheyenne. We got half an hour almost before lunch. What I want to do is get a couple of our overseas people in right now. Basil Arkell, who flew autogyros and R4s in England right at the beginning of a helicopter. And then we're going to have Jean Bollet, who's got a schedule problem this afternoon. And if we get past those, then Miller Walks will be the next on. So Basil, are you ready?
Where would you like me to go? Over here?
Oh, 3 o'clock. Oh, all right. I misunderstood. Okay. All right. Yes, you're ready.
Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm afraid I haven't any advanced technology to talk to you about. I haven't any sophisticated films, but I thought you might like to hear one or two anecdotes of the very elementary state of the art that we had to contend with when we first started flying at Floyd Bennett Field with the US Coast Guard. Middle of the war, the success percolated through to England, and the Admiralty wanted to use helicopters for anti-submarine work. They put in an order for Sikorsky R5s, and the R5 was the predecessor of the S-51. It had the pilot sat in the rear seat, and the observer, watching for any signs of submarine periscopes and that sort of thing, would be up in the bubble in the front. With the R5s, or with the prospect of the R5s, they also ordered 5 R4s. And they put in about 6 or 7 Navy pilots to learn to fly these R4s with the eventual prospect of taking the R5s out. And at that time, I was flying with the 529 Squadron in the RAF on autogyros. And the Air Ministry, I think, didn't want the Navy to have their toes into the rotating wing field without finding out what was going on. And so they sent 3 or 4 RAF pilots from 529 Squadron, the autogyro pilots, to Floyd Bennett Field to develop the R4 with the Navy pilots. And we were flying around there, doing local flying, getting used to the handling characteristics. We had all been fixed-wing pilots, of course, and we had to get used to the different handling characteristics of the rotating wing aircraft. We've heard a very interesting talk from Sergei Sikorsky about his developments, his father's developments with the VS-300. And shortly after the success of that, it was, I think he was saying, in about 1942, the first R4 was tested. It was an XR4. We had at Floyd Bennett Field YR4s to start with. The US Coast Guard were interested in them for general reconnaissance purposes. And the Navy, the British Navy's 5 R4s, were located at Floyd Bennett Field alongside the US Coast Guard machine. So there were about 9 helicopters there in the hangar. And one of the things that in those days, these machines were full of vibrations. They all emanated from the rotor, and there were no hydraulic controls, no electronics. Anything that was happening in the rotor was coming straight back to the pilot's cyclic pitch stick, his control stick. And we used to reckon if we got the aircraft out of the hangar in the morning, we used to reckon that if the top of the stick was not describing a circle of greater than about 2 or 3 inches radius, that machine was more or less all right to fly. They were very, very lumpy. But we developed methods of smoothing out the rotors. The blades were steel spars with wooden ribs and covered in fabric. And it was not, no 2 blades were exactly the same. And when you sat in the cockpit and you could see the tip path plane up ahead of you, you could see that the blades were all following different tracks. And so we had to find methods of tracking the blades. And the first the first system we used was very elementary. It was a long pole with a paintbrush tied to the end of it, and the brush was dipped in a can of creosote, sort of light tarry paint. And the system was that you engaged the clutch, got the rotor running at approximately 5 degrees pitch, pulled it up a little bit, and at about 1,500 engine revs, which gave us about 150 rotor revs. And then 2 men would very carefully raise the pole up until it was under the rotor, and the brush touched the lowest blade. And when they'd got a touch, you had to stop shut the engine down and stop everything. And then an adjustment was made to the angle of incidence on the rotor head of the lowest blade to bring it up to the next one. And then you do it again. And so gradually we were raising the incidence of the blades one by one until we got a fairly reasonable tip path plane, and the vibration was reduced. And probably an average, when we finished the tracking, we'd get the vibration on the top of the stick down to about an inch diameter circle, and that was, we reckoned, was fair enough. Now, we had rather an amusing incident following on from that. On the Sikorsky R4, there was a pitch indicator which was a small tube which stuck up from the instrument panel, and there was a pointer in it. As you raised the collective pitch lever, the pointer raised up and indicated from 0 up to a maximum of, I believe it was 10 degrees. We used to train the fitters to warm up the engines in the early morning, ready for a flight program. And on one occasion, we had one sergeant fitter. His name was Culver, and he was a Scotsman with red hair, and he was always known as Ginger Culver. And he started up the engine, let the clutch in, and raised the collective pitch up to an indicated 5 degrees, and ran the engine at about 1,500 revs to warm up the motor. After about 10 minutes, when he got up to the operating temperature, I forget exactly what that was. It was probably about 200 centigrade. But anyway, when he got ready to test the magnetos, he opened up to full revs, which would have been 2,000 revs, with the throttle. And of course, as I have explained, the stick would be, he would be holding both sticks. But what he didn't realize was that that particular machine had been tracked on several previous days, and there was a lot more actual incidence on the blades themselves than was indicated on the indicator. And so when he had 5 degrees indicated, he had about 7 degrees, or possibly even a little more, on the blades themselves. So when he opened up to 2,000 RPM to test the mags, he took off. And there was never more surprised sergeant fitter in his life. Fortunately, he was only about a foot up, and he didn't lose his head, and he slapped it back down on the ground again without breaking anything. But it was a good story, but that was the sort of thing we had to contend with. Eventually, the tracking was improved by using a flag and chalking the tips of the blades with different colored chalks. A canvas flag on a long pole would be turned into the tip of the blades, and then you would have 3 colored chalk marks on the flag. So we went on. We flew several hundred hours there at Floyd Bennett Field, and eventually we brought 5 aircraft back, the 5 R4s back on an aircraft carrier in a convoy, and we set up a school at Andover in England to train Army cooperation pilots, because by that time the anti-submarine control had been solved, and the Navy cancelled the order for R5s, and that was the time when it was eventually converted developed into the S51. Now, I don't know how much more time there is. One other amusing incident that I had was that the US Navy wanted to try calibrating their gun sight weapon systems with a helicopter, and so there was cooperation from the US Coast Guard, and they did some modifications to one of the R4s. They fitted reflective aerials onto it, and fitted an RT set in it, and they suggested that I should go over and do it because I'd done I was used to radar calibration from the autogyros. So off I went. This destroyer was anchored just down south of New York. It must have been a little bit down southeast of Staten Island. And so off we went. I took a chief, I think he was a chief petty officer from the Coast Guard with me to operate the radio, because obviously, as one of the other speakers said, you couldn't let go of the 2 sticks, collective and cyclic sticks, to operate a radio at that time. So anyway, we found this destroyer, and the first problem we had was that this chief petty officer turned to me, Miller his name was, he turned to me and said, I can't get the radio to work, I can't raise them. And he said, can you go and hover alongside the bridge and I'll see if I can contact them. So I expect you've probably seen pictures of an R4. You have a sliding window. So anyway, I went and hovered alongside this destroyer's bridge. And this chief petty officer was, he opened the window down on his side, and he hung out of the window, and he was waving his arms about like this and semaphoring to the signaller on the bridge. And I was hovering at about 30 feet alongside the bridge wings, and normally the R4 wouldn't hover out of ground effect, but there was a little bit of breeze out there, and so really I was flying forward but not moving at about 10 knots, something like that. But anyway, he turned round to me after a bit of arm waving and said, "They want you to hover at 5,000 feet. And I said, "What?" We had been doing local flying around Floyd Bennett Field, and none of us, even for autorotation practice, we'd never been much over 1,000 or 1,500 feet. And this was fairly, I thought, impossible. But anyway, we clambered up to 5,000 feet, and I managed to stay there for a while. But the first thing that happened was that we found we were in the circuit for LaGuardia. This was 1944, and we must have been in the circuit for LaGuardia airfield, and we were being swooped past by civil airliners in round about the size of Dakotas. And I think they were all having a good look and wondering what the dickens we were doing there. Anyway, we did manage to do it. And I've got in my logbook, the flight was, by the time I got back, it was 1 hour 50. But both my hands were sort of very numb by the time I got back on the ground. But at least it worked. I don't know, we never knew what the Navy did with their experiments, but as far as we're concerned, we got away with that without breaking anything. Anyway, at some day, I shall be here for this afternoon, and if anyone would like any more to ask any questions about the autogyros, we were using those for radar calibration. And I'd be only pleased to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Can I make a 2-minute comment on his tracking problems?
Sure. We'll make 2 minutes and we'll break for lunch.
Voice sympathy to you
Yes?
in your efforts to track the YR4.
Yes?
I was working on that stuff at the plant, trying to get the strain gauge ship to be flyable over the envelope.
Yes?
Can you hear me?
Why don't you come up here, Glenn?
All right.
You all right?
I need a hand. Old
Okay.
age.
How to
Sympathy to you. Struggling with those problems at Sikorsky, I can vouch for the fact that he could absolutely not get a smooth stick without a 1 per rev in the fuselage, or vice versa. Rarely a set of blades came together that would fly in formation, but that was rare. We were too neophytish to understand that the pitching moments on the blades due to camber were the cause of the problem. The ships absolutely could not be tracked with pitch. We woke up to the fact that we had to adjust the trailing edges, not only somewhere, but suitably outboard or inboard, up, down, blah, blah. So he learned how to trim the blades, pitching moment-wise, which came as a benefit to the R4s, which flew much more decently.
Very good.
Our regrets to what we subjected you to.
Okay, I was told that the lunch break is at 12 o'clock, which is in 2 minutes according to my watch. So let's break. After the lunch break, we're going to have several of these corporate presentations, and then we'll get back to the individual ones. So try to be back here by 1 o'clock, please. Darned if I know. I think it's going to be box lunches. I suspect it's back where the coffee was. So